Okay, when you hear the name Adam Smith, what's the first thing that usually pops into your head?
9 times out of 10, it's the wealth of nations, right?
Right.
The whole foundation of modern economics, that famous invisible hand guiding markets.
Yeah.
Um, that's the image that's stuck.
Exactly. And he absolutely deserves that recognition for sure. But the thing is, Smith wrote another massive, incredibly influential book, published even earlier, back in 1759.
The theory of moral sentiments.
That's the one. And this one isn't really about economies. It's about us. It's about the fundamental human question of how we figure out right from wrong, how we judge ourselves and everyone around us, and, what truly connects us.
It's basically his map of human psychology,
Hmm.
specifically the moral and social bits. Some people argue you can't even fully grasp his economic ideas without understanding this.
Hmm.
This deeper foundation of human behavior he laid out first.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got a stack of excerpts from this amazing book, and we're going to explore Smith's core ideas. His concept of sympathy, how we judge actions as proper or deserving reward or punishment, the surprising function of our inner conscience, how society shapes our moral landscape, and even how he, stacked his views up against other philosophical ideas about virtue.
So our mission really is to take you on a deep dive into Smith's framework for understanding the human heart and mind, to uncover the hidden springs behind why we feel the way we do about our own behavior and the actions of others, and to see what drives human connection beyond just, well, basic transactions.
All right, let's jump right in then. Smith kicks things off by talking about what he calls sympathy. Now, you might hear that word and think pity or feeling sorry for someone, but Smith's definition is much broader, much more active.
That's absolutely right. For Smith, sympathy isn't just feeling for someone, it's about feeling with them.
With them, okay.
Yeah, it's the act of imagining yourself in their exact situation, putting yourself in their shoes, and experiencing a feeling that corresponds to theirs. You're trying to, match their emotion in your own mind.
Okay, so it's almost like a mental simulation. You're running their scenario in your own head and seeing what emotion it generates for you.
Exactly. And this simulation is the basis for judgment. Smith says something fascinating here. Every faculty in one man is the measure by which he judges of the like faculty in another.
Meaning?
Meaning, we judge someone else's ability to see by our own eyesight, their reasoning by our own reason.
And crucially, their emotions by our own capacity for those emotions in that imagined scenario. You're judging their level of joy or their level of resentment against your own internal gauge for those feelings in that circumstance.
Precisely. Your own experience becomes the standard, the sort of projection screen onto which you evaluate their reaction.
Now, this is where Smith gives us some genuinely surprising insights into human nature. He points out certain feelings that are really hard to sympathize with, like extreme bodily sensations. He mentions violent hunger. Why is that?
Well, think about it. You and I are sitting here, hopefully well-fed. We can intellectualize what extreme hunger must feel like, but we can't actually feel it with someone right now in the same way they are. That specific, intense physical disposition isn't something we can replicate sympathetically at a distance. He even notes it feels kind of indecent for someone to display extreme bodily passions because others simply can't fully share that particular sensation.
Okay.
We can sympathize with the distress that hunger causes, the anxiety, the fear, but not the raw physical hunger itself.
That's a key distinction, the distress versus the raw feeling. And he applies this to joy and grief, too, in a sort of counterintuitive way. You might think we'd easily sympathize with someone who's just won the lottery, right?
Yeah.
Huge joy.
You'd think. But Smith says we actually sympathize more easily with the small joys of everyday life, sharing a meal, good conversation, pleasant company, than with great prosperity.
Really? Why?
Well, this is a brilliant insight. Great prosperity can often trigger envy, which is basically the opposite of sympathy. It pushes you away.
Ah, right.
But the simple pleasures, we can all readily connect with the feeling of enjoying a good cup of coffee or a pleasant chat. That's why habitual cheerfulness, finding pleasure in the little things, is so engaging, so easy to sympathize with.
Makes sense.
It's also why youth is so often engaging. It's the season of finding simple gaiety everywhere, you know?
So while great fortune can kind of isolate you emotionally from others, a simple good mood, based on small joys, makes you universally appealing.
What about the flip side? Suffering.
Deep affliction, yes, that definitely calls forth great sympathy. But small vexations, the little annoyances of life. Smith observes we often feel very little sympathy, or sometimes even a kind of negative reaction.
Negative, like what? Annoyance? Or like finding them amusing? He suggests our delight in raillery, in teasing someone or making fun of their small troubles, comes precisely from finding those small vexations in others. Diverting.
Ouch. So next time someone tells me a minor complaint and I have to fight the urge to smirk, that's Smith's observation at work.
Exactly. He says men of refinement learn to hide their small pains or turn them into a joke because they know others might privately find them amusing. It's a bit harsh, but maybe true.
He also touches on sympathizing with love, and it's kind of odd, isn't it? He says we don't really sympathize with the specific passion for that particular person.
No, not the feeling for the beloved individual. What interests us and what we sympathize with is the situation of being in love.
The situation.
Yeah, it stirs up other emotions we can relate to. The hope of reciprocated affection, the fear of rejection, the distress of uncertainty. It's the drama of the situation, the lover's hopes and fears, not the unique feeling for the beloved that we connect with.
Like that sea voyage analogy again, it's not the hunger itself, but the distress occasioned by hunger that resonates. With love, it's the hopes and anxieties of the lover. He even says the idealized romantic or pastoral life often seems more appealing to us when described as hoped for, rather than when it's described as actually being enjoyed.
Because the hope stirs relatable aspirations and anxieties. The actual enjoyment is private and, well, harder for us to fully enter into sympathetically unless it's framed around those small, shareable pleasures we talked about.
There seems to be a real effort involved in sympathy, too. He notes sympathy with pain is often more distinct than with pleasure.
We feel the resistance, don't we? We often try and sometimes fail to suppress sympathy with sorrow, especially when the suffering person isn't even there. That effort makes the feeling noticeable.
Right.
But we give way very easily to joy, almost passively,
Yeah.
unless that old friend, envy, shows up.
So we feel sympathy with sorrow when we wish we didn't, and miss it with joy when we'd actually welcome it. It seems our capacity for sympathizing with suffering, while still falling short of the actual pain, is strong enough to intrude even when we resist.
Exactly. But with joy, it's much weaker, easily blocked by envy or just indifference. It reveals the complex, often challenging social landscape we navigate internally.
Okay. Building on this idea of sympathetic resonance, Smith explains how we use it to judge the propriety of actions.
Right. An action, or more accurately, the sentiment behind the action, appears proper or suitable to the situation when the spectator, that is, you, the observer, imagining yourself in their place, can fully sympathize with the feelings of the person doing the action.
So propriety is about whether the emotion or reaction fits the circumstance in a way I can emotionally agree with by putting myself in their shoes. Is that it?
That's it, exactly. It's the suitability of the sentiment to the context, verified by the sympathetic process. From propriety, we then move to judging merit and demerit.
Deserving reward or punishment.
Precisely. Actions deserving reward are the proper objects of gratitude. Actions deserving punishment are the proper objects of resentment. It's a direct connection between the action, the resulting emotion in others, gratitude or resentment, and the sympathetic judgment of the spectator.
But the motive behind the action is key, isn't it? You can't just sympathize with someone's gratitude if the person they're grateful to acted for a terrible reason.
Absolutely crucial. The impartial spectator must be able to sympathize with the motives of the agent. If the benefactor's motives were improper, your sympathy for the recipient's gratitude is diminished, maybe vanishes.
And the opposite.
If the agent's motives were perfectly proper and understandable from the spectator's view, you won't sympathize with any resentment directed towards them, even if the outcome was accidentally bad.
Okay.
Smith even brings up elusive sympathies, where your sense of whether something deserves reward or punishment comes from how you would feel if you were the one affected, even if the actual person involved feels differently. Sort of projecting your own reaction.
That adds another layer of potential bias to the judgment process. This ties into his view of justice, which sounds quite strict. Smith says there's no proper motive for harming a neighbor unless it's just indignation for harm they've already inflicted.
Right. From the impartial spectator's viewpoint, you just can't approve someone hurting another purely for their own self-interest, even if, naturally, they value their own happiness more than anyone else's.
So to judge justly,
You have to step outside yourself and see yourself as others see you as just one, often, as he puts it, insignificant part of the wider world, not the center of it all.
seeing ourselves as an insignificant part of the world, that's a humbling perspective. Now, one of the most fascinating points in the source, I think, is how Smith analyzes the tricky case of negligence.
Ah, yes. This is where the tension between motive and consequence really comes alive. Smith says gross negligence does deserve blame, even if no harm happens. His example is classic, throwing a big stone over a wall into a busy public street without warning. That shows a clear contempt for the safety of others, a disregard. And that disregard is an injustice in itself. It deserves chastisement.
Okay, so the bad motive, or lack of good motive, warrants blame even if no one gets hurt. But what happens if someone is hurt? If that stone hits someone?
Here's the crucial insight Smith reveals about human nature. Our indignation, our sense of how much punishment is deserved, is dramatically inflamed by the actual consequences.
How so?
If that stone thrown negligently happens to kill someone, the thrower, by the old laws of Scotland Smith mentions, might face the severest punishment, maybe even death.
But the motive, the negligence, was the same whether it hit someone or not. The level of carelessness didn't change.
Precisely. This is the core tension. By strict reason, the punishment should probably be proportional to the motive and the level of fault, the disregard shown.
Yeah.
But our natural sentiments, fueled by intense sympathy for the victim and their suffering family, dramatically elevate our indignation when the consequence is severe. Our gut reaction takes over.
So our gut reaction, driven by consequence and sympathy, can override a colder, more rational judgment based purely on the original intention or motive.
That's exactly what Smith is highlighting. Our sense of justice is not purely rational. It's deeply intertwined with our sympathetic response to the outcome, to the harm done. He sees this consequence-driven indignation, even if sometimes it feels disproportionate, as a kind of natural mechanism. Resentment itself, though often viewed negatively, isn't disapproved by the impartial spectator if it's moderated to match the spectator's sympathetic indignation for the injury.
But excessive resentment, pure revenge.
Oh, that's highly detestable, because the impartial spectator simply cannot go along with that level of passion. Smith views this moderated resentment, this desire to see the offender punished proportionally, as an instinctive mechanism implanted by nature for the protection of society.
Like hunger driving us to eat.
Exactly. Similar to how hunger drives us to eat for self-preservation, without us necessarily needing to understand the complex biology. Resentment, properly channeled, protects the social order.
Okay, shifting gears again slightly. We've talked a lot about judging others. How does this sympathetic process, this idea of the spectator, work when we turn that gaze inward? How do we judge ourselves?
Smith says it's fundamentally the same mechanism. To judge our own conduct, our motives, our feelings, we have to try to step outside our own immediate perspective.
How?
We imagine ourselves as that impartial spectator, an objective imaginary other, and view our actions through their eyes.
So that feeling of conscience, of an inner judge, is really this internalized, impartial spectator. Is that Smith's model?
Yes, that's Smith's model for conscience. Our self-judgment is a constant, though maybe often unconscious, reference to how an impartial, informed observer would see us. We are, in a sense, constantly examining our conduct through the eyes of this idealized other.
This leads to an important distinction Smith makes, the difference between wanting to please others and wanting to be praiseworthy.
This is a critical point for understanding virtue. The desire to please is natural, of course, especially maybe in children. But the desire to be worthy of approbation, to be the kind of person that an impartial spectator ought to approve of, regardless of whether actual people are watching or approving, that's the more profound and, well, virtuous desire.
So it's not about getting likes on social media, to use a modern phrase, but about being the kind of person who deserves the likes even if you never actually get them.
Exactly. Smith says this desire to be praiseworthy is much stronger in well-formed minds. Wise individuals value the state of being praiseworthy far more than they value actually receiving unmerited praise. Getting applause you didn't earn feels, or should feel, hollow.
Right.
Whereas applause you might never get is, well, that's the real substance of virtue.
And the flip side of the desire to be praiseworthy must be the horror of blameworthiness.
Which, Smith argues, can be even stronger than the dread of actually being blamed. He talks about people who voluntarily confess to crimes or submit to punishment, not necessarily because they're afraid of getting caught, but to quiet that terrible inner voice, that impartial spectator, to appease their own conscience.
He contrasts this with profligate criminals.
Yes. He notes that hardened criminals often lack this deep horror. They have so little sense of the inherent wrongness of their actions, the baseness of their conduct, as he puts it, that they feel no remorse. They just see punishment as bad luck, an external inconvenience. The pain of the innocent man unjustly accused and punished, like the callous example he mentions, a man tortured and killed for a crime he didn't commit, is primarily rooted in the agony of unmerited disgrace, the stain on his memory and reputation in the eyes of others, rather than remorse, obviously.
That's incredibly insightful. The deepest suffering isn't always physical pain, but the perceived moral stain, the injustice in how you're seen. He also makes an interesting observation about why we're more vulnerable to public opinion in some fields than others.
Think about things where judgment is subjective, like poetry or art. There's no objective proof that your poem is good or bad in the way you can prove a math theorem.
Right.
Smith points out that great poets like Racine or Pope were famously sensitive to criticism, even petty stuff.
Because without that clear objective standard, you're more reliant on external validation, on what others think.
Precisely. In fields with clear criteria or demonstration, criticism might sting less because you can perhaps rely on the objective truth or method. But where it's subjective, you're much more exposed to the winds of public favor and criticism. It makes you anxious.
For those unjustly afflicted, like the callous example, Smith offers a form of comfort rooted in his larger worldview, doesn't he?
He does. He mentions the possibility of appealing to a still higher tribunal, to that of the all-seeing judge of the world. This hope for ultimate justice, where one's innocence and virtue will eventually be recognized by a perfect, all-knowing being, can provide solace and maintain cheerfulness even under immense, undeserved calamity.
So the impartial spectator can become divine in the face of ultimate injustice. Where do these moral rules, these standards that the impartial spectator uses, even come from? Smith has a specific sort of empirical view.
He argues they don't come from some innate list or abstract reasoning first. General rules of morality are formed from our repeated experience of observing particular actions and consistently approving or disapproving of them through the sympathetic process.
So we see an action, our internal spectator judges it, we do this repeatedly, and then we generalize a rule from those consistent judgments, like induction.
Exactly. The rule "murder is wrong" isn't pre-programmed in his view. It's a generalization derived from the near-universal human experience of disapproving, via the sympathetic spectator, of the act of one person unjustly taking the life of another. They're observations about what tends to make people objects of odiousness or admiration.
And Smith sees these moral faculties, this capacity for sympathetic judgment and the impartial spectator, as supreme within us, not just another feeling.
Right. They are just another passion, like ambition or fear. He compares them to our senses. Sight judges color, hearing judges harmony. Our moral sense judges right and wrong, fit and improper. These faculties are meant to regulate all our other passions. What we mean by right or wrong is ultimately what pleases or displeases these specific moral faculties.
And he connects this inner mechanism to a larger purpose.
Yes, suggesting these faculties align us with the plan of providence, aimed at maximizing human happiness. By acting virtuously, guided by these faculties, we are, in a sense, cooperating with the benevolent design of the author of nature.
That adds a layer of cosmic significance to our everyday moral struggles. Now, how does the world outside us, society and its customs, imprint on this inner moral sense?
Smith acknowledges the powerful influence of custom and fashion. He starts with something simpler, like what we consider beautiful externally: architecture, clothing. Custom dictates so much of what seems proper or agreeable, sometimes even overriding pure utility or inherent form.
Like how architectural styles become fashionable, or clothing trends that seem bizarre later on. It's not always about what's most practical or inherently beautiful, but what we're used to seeing and what society approves of at that moment.
Precisely. While he says custom isn't the only basis for external beauty, its influence is immense. And he argues custom and fashion influence our moral sentiments in a similar way, though maybe less completely.
How so? How does custom affect morals?
Well, being raised in good company, surrounded by virtuous examples, heightens your sensitivity to virtue and makes you more repulsed by vice. You develop finer moral distinctions.
Whereas being brought up in a corrupt environment, it normalizes vice.
Yes. It loses its dreadful enormity, as he puts it, and just becomes part of the landscape, the way of the world. He notes how standards for things like politeness, frugality, or generosity vary hugely between different ages and countries, and people within those societies tend to see their own standard as the correct golden mean.
So custom sets the local dial on these virtues, what's considered normal.
To a significant extent, yes. But he believes this influence rarely completely perverts natural sentiment. The general moral tone of a nation is usually somewhat suited to its conditions. Think hardiness valued in a rough environment, or delicate sensibility in a more refined one.
Okay.
While some virtues might get out of balance due to custom, like excessive hospitality leading to poor economy, the core moral compass isn't totally erased, in his view. Basic justice usually holds.
He also describes a natural hierarchy in our social affections and loyalties.
Yes, nature directs our affections towards societies that are most important and closest to us. Family comes first. The mutual sympathy among siblings is essential for family happiness. Then come friendships, with the most respected ones based on shared esteem and virtue.
And ultimately, our primary loyalty is to our own state or sovereignty.
Because it's the structure that protects us and everyone we care about, our children, parents, friends. It becomes endeared to us through both our self-interest and our private benevolent affections for those within it.
This leads to national pride.
And partiality, yes. Sometimes even national prejudices against neighbors. But he observes this prejudice is often less intense against very distant nations, perhaps because our capacity for effective benevolence towards them is so limited anyway, we can't really help them much.
That makes sense. You can't actively benefit people on the other side of the world in the same concrete way you can your local community. Smith also has a cautionary note about becoming too enamored with abstract systems.
This is another sharp insight. He observes that people, particularly those in power or positions of influence, can fall in love with the idea of a perfect system, a perfectly running government, a perfectly optimized economy. And in doing so, they can sometimes prioritize the means, perfecting the system's mechanics, over the true end, which should be human happiness and well-being.
Like a politician obsessed with intricate regulations or economic models, potentially losing sight of the actual impact on people's lives.
Exactly. He contrasts the celebrated legislator of Muscovy, probably Peter the Great, who reformed the system with immense public spirit but seemed to lack basic humanity towards individuals, with the social and well-natured James I of England, who had plenty of humanity but little interest or skill in the machinery of government.
It's a powerful illustration of how public spirit and humanity don't always walk hand in hand.
Indeed. He also suggests, quite shrewdly, that to motivate ambition in someone who isn't naturally driven by it, you're more likely to succeed by describing the arrangement and convenience of wealth, the fancy house, the servants, the gadgets, the carriages.
Rather than just saying wealth means you won't be cold or hungry.
Exactly. Because describing the possessions, the trappings of wealth, appeals to that love of system, order, and the appearance of things, even if those are just means to the basic end of comfort. It's a subtle point about what truly motivates us beyond simple need. Our imagination gets captured by the system.
Let's briefly touch on how Smith engages with different philosophical views on what constitutes virtue itself. He doesn't just present his own system in isolation.
No, he surveys several major systems. There are those that place virtue primarily in propriety, like the Stoics, those that place it in prudence, like Epicurus, or those that place it in benevolence, like Hutcheson and some later Platonists.
He looks at the Stoics and their emphasis on aligning oneself with reason and nature, being indifferent to external ends, focusing on duty, and seeing oneself as part of a larger, divinely ordered system. He does note their controversial views on the justification of suicide.
Right, and while respecting their focus on propriety and self-command, Smith critiques the Stoic system for not adequately explaining merit and demerit, why some actions deserve reward and others punishment. He also felt it perhaps lacked a practical, measurable standard for propriety compared to his own impartial spectator. It could seem too harsh or unrealistic.
Then there's Epicurus, who believed bodily pleasure and pain were the ultimate good and bad, making virtue valuable only as a means to achieve pleasure or avoid pain.
Smith contrasts this sharply with the view that man is made for action, not just passive sensation, and that virtue is inherently desirable for its own sake, bringing its own kind of pleasure. He also notes Epicurus's famous, perhaps glib, attempt to dismiss the fear of death. When we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not.
Right. He also mentions philosophers like Hobbes, who controversially argued that right and wrong were simply whatever the civil magistrate decreed, denying any natural moral distinction prior to law.
And critics of Hobbes often argued for an innate faculty to distinguish right from wrong, sometimes attributing it solely to reason. Smith, while valuing reason, clearly sees his own framework of moral sentiments in the impartial spectator as a more complete explanation for the origin and nature of moral judgments. It's not just reason, it's feeling guided by perspective.
Finally, he discusses the limits of casuistry. What was that about?
Casuistry was the attempt, especially in some theological traditions, to create incredibly precise rules for every conceivable moral duty and scenario, like a giant moral rule book.
Yeah.
Smith argues this approach really struggles with virtues like generosity or magnanimity, where a lack doesn't cause the same kind of sharp remorse as a violation of justice.
Yeah.
How do you make a strict rule for how generous to be?
Good point.
He also finds it kind of futile to try and subject nuanced moral feelings, like where exactly does harmless irony cross the line into a deceptive lie, to strict universal rules. It misses the context-dependent nature of moral judgment. Positive laws, he suggests, are often just imperfect attempts to capture the more fundamental, natural rules of justice.
And one last, almost whimsical detail he adds. The natural human tendency towards credulity, believing things easily.
Especially in children, yes. Nature makes children trusting, he thinks, for their own protection and learning. Experience slowly teaches distrust, but Smith dryly observes, rarely enough. Even the most cautious among us often believe improbable stories or reports that we're later embarrassed about falling for. It's a charming reminder of our inherent openness, perhaps, even when the world isn't always trustworthy.
Wow, that really is a deep dive into Smith's world beyond just economics. We've journeyed from his unique idea of sympathy feeling with others through how we judge actions based on propriety and merit. Introduced that crucial inner impartial spectator that guides our own conscience and sense of duty.
We've seen how society and custom, though powerful, don't completely warp our natural moral feelings, and explored the importance of virtues like prudence and self-command, driven by striving towards that high ideal of perfection judged by the inner spectator.
And we've touched on how he positioned his ideas against other major philosophical systems of his time. It's clear this isn't just historical curiosity. These are fundamental mechanisms of human psychology and social interaction that are absolutely relevant today. How does that inner impartial spectator talk to you? Where do you see the influence of custom shaping your own sense of right and wrong?
Smith provides a really timeless framework for understanding the complex interplay between our inner world and the social world around us. It's still incredibly insightful.
So here's a thought for you to ponder from Smith's text. Given his observation that our sense of justice is powerfully, perhaps even disproportionately influenced by the actual consequences of an action, like that vast difference in reaction between a stone thrown negligently that hits someone and one that misses, even though the initial fault was the same, how much of our modern response to accidents, mistakes, or even crimes, especially when reported in the media, is truly based on a calm assessment of motive and proportionality, and how much is driven by our instinctive, consequence-inflamed indignation fueled by sympathy for the victim? Something to think about.